Good afternoon. My name is Leo Barassi, and thank you very much for joining this briefing on climate impact adaptation, what adaptation finance is needed, and what to look for over the coming week and a half. Very pleased to be joined by this wonderful panel today. I will briefly introduce them. They will give a short introductory remarks each, and then we will open the floor to questions. So, starting on my immediate right, we have Joyce Kimutai, a climate scientist with World Weather Attribution and an advisor to the Kenyan delegation. Next to her, we have Mariana Pauli, the Global Advocacy Lead at Christian Aid. And next to her, we have Rachel Cletus, Policy Director at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And very shortly, we're about to be joined on stage by Emain Saidi, Diplomacy and Cooperation Researcher at IMAL, Initiative for Climate and Development. So we'll go in this order, and I will ask Joyce to begin with introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leo, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Looking forward to interesting discussion during this session. As Leo has mentioned, my name is Joyce Kimutai. I am with the World Weather Attribution team. And I also advise government on Kenyan government on the sort of the technical stuff that link to negotiations here in this process, the UNFCCC. So just to give really a summary of what we'll be doing today and sort of give a background of sort of the information that forms sort of the basis of what we'll be discussing in this side event today. Is that as part of the World Weather Attribution, which is an initiative of global scientists that look at extreme events and try to understand what exactly is the role of climate change in sort of the frequencies and the intensities of extreme events happening across the world. And very interesting in these past years this initiative actually started 10 years ago. So we recently celebrated our 10th anniversary. But this field of attribution science started, it's been like 20 years now. So it's not really new. A lot of advancement in methodology has happened over the past years. So when we celebrated the anniversary, we actually got a report that we tried to summarize what happened in the last 10 years. And I'll tell you that we found out that at least 10 deadliest weather disasters since the year 2004 that resulted in more than 1 million deaths were actually worsened by climate change. And this year alone, for sure, more than 200 extreme events sort of met the category of the World Weather Attribution, the sort of the trigger criteria, where we look at number of deaths reported. We also look at people affected or the percentage of the population affected. So basically a criteria that is just intended to capture the most impactful events. So this year alone, using that criteria, we found that more than 200 extreme events around the world made this criteria. So that is so overwhelming, even for a small group like us, to respond to more than 200 events, to understand what exactly is happening to climate change in these events. And these events are quite impactful because our criteria, in the criteria, we pick the most impactful events. So it's not just the extremity in terms of the of the meteorological aspect alone, but also in terms of the impacts on humans and in society in general. And also this year, what we found out is at least 15 national temperature records were broken this year alone. And just something else to note is that in the first 2 weeks of this month of November, is that, thank you, in the first weeks of November is that we've seen new record temperatures in most parts of Europe and parts of North Africa. So we're basically seeing really escalation of impacts across the world caused by these record-breaking disasters happening, these record-breaking assets causing widespread and localized impacts on humans and natural systems in general. So this is just to say that really there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of adaptation, and it's really supporting the most vulnerable that are most impacted by these extreme events. And I think that is one of the biggest discussions or the agendas in this process is now to talk about what is the kind of finances that is required or the support that is required to support these most vulnerable communities. So I'll hand over to Mariana to...
So why finance needs to be from public sources and grants-based, not from private? Today, Christian Aid launched a report, Putting Our Money Where Our Mouth Is, which I would like to give you two stats. The first one, really a small fraction of private finance is reaching the countries that need the most. Less than 3% going to low-income countries in 2022. And the second one, less than 50 cents of every $100 in climate finance is international private finance directed towards adaptation, leaving so that the vulnerable communities really in need to cope with the climate change. So to some extent, when we look at this new goal, when we look at the NCQG, it could be a unique opportunity to ensure ambition, but ambition to really meet the needs of developing countries, of those most affected by climate change, have done the least to contribute that. So that means securing public grants-based finance at scale for adaptation, for loss and damage. It's about fairness, it's about justice. So the core, it has to be public grants-based finance at scale, because we know that private finance has a limited role in mitigation. It neglects adaptation, and it's completely unacceptable and inappropriate for loss and damage. So that means any big, shiny number that comes out in this as a result of these negotiations without the quality, which means public grants finance, will be meaningless. Now, we know that there is a big push in these negotiations to have more private sector-led solutions. So if we go under this narrative, that means really shifting the burden. Instead of developed countries fulfilling their commitments under the Paris Agreement and the Climate Convention, it shifts the burden to the climate sector to deliver it. So instead of needs-based, it will be profit-driven. But there are just no profits to be found in the needs of the poor communities in developing countries. So we cannot accept that, and developing countries cannot accept a deal that does not address their needs. So it's much more closer to what economist Daniela Gabor calls like the Wall Street climate consensus being brought inside of these negotiations. So we need to shift this narrative. We know there is not lack of public money. We saw this with COVID. We saw this when banks were rescued. And we see so much the potential if we address tax avoidance, tax evasion, and start taxing fossil fuel companies and have progressive taxation in place. That can really help bring the public resources needed. At the moment, there is rich countries are spending over 2% of their GDP in military spending and trillions on fossil fuel subsidies. If they shift that, we can certainly cut the pie in a different way. What we need is the political will, and we really hope that in this COP we still have that opportunity to bring that scaled-up grants-based finance for adaptation and for those who need the most. And this is what civil society will be fighting in this COP. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As we know, 2024 is virtually certain to be the hottest year on record. We're seeing global heat trapping emissions continuing to rise alarmingly, and the impacts are being felt all around the world. We've seen a stunning, unprecedented amount of extreme fossil fuel disasters across the world, including in the United States. So even richer nations are not immune from the destruction, the ravages being caused by this buildup of emissions coming primarily from richer countries. So we're here at this COP to see responsibility being taken, because as these emissions continue to rise, the focus on mitigation is obviously crucial. We need strong NDCs, strong emission reduction commitments by February next year. But equally, the failure to act, the gross insufficient action to date, and the harmful actions of fossil fuel industries on top of that, has left us at a very dangerous moment where adaptation needs are rising, loss and damage is increasing. We know from the UNEP's recent adaptation gap report that now that adaptation finance gap is up to $359 billion per year. The IPCC's sixth assessment report is very clear that this urgent need to close this gap and align adaptation finance with sustainable development goals is crucial. What we're seeing here is richer nations continuing to fail to meet their existing obligations, including doubling finance by next year. And the NCQG negotiations right now, which need to include, alongside mitigation, a very robust component for adaptation and loss and damage, are quite fraught at this moment. We're still not seeing richer nations step up to their responsibility. We need to see here a quantum on the order of at least $1 trillion per year, starting in 2025, and that's why a number of US-based groups have sent a letter to the Biden administration urging them to support that level of meaningful action. We also need to see this from a fairness and justice point of view, because the fact of the matter is, while richer nations are hiding behind politics, claiming that they can't meet, it's too difficult to meet these needs, they're passing the buck to lower income nations, because who is bearing the cost right now, the human toll of these extreme impacts, is people who have contributed the least to the problem and yet find themselves on the front lines of this crisis. If we don't get a strong agreement here, we're going to see a complete breakdown in trust from those countries who are on the front lines of this crisis. And remember that if nations don't deliver strong NDCs, we're going to see the gap continue to increase. Those adaptation needs will continue to mount. So these are very interlocked asks that we have here at COP.
Hi. So I think my colleagues covered pretty comprehensively the climate impacts that we've experienced this year. I can touch a bit on my own experience in Morocco. So this year, we went from a state of emergency in terms of drought and water scarcity to the unprecedented torrential rains in September and even throughout October. Most of Morocco lives in rural areas, and in those areas we've seen villages drown under those torrential rains. Buildings were collapsing, oases were also drowning. Palm trees that were aged 100 years have been knocked out. Moroccan citizens who are 90-year-old, 95-year-old have been testifying that the impacts that they've witnessed this year are completely unprecedented, and they have not seen them in their lifetime ever. So this leads to the lack of adaptive capacity. This revealed the lack of resilience and the risks and vulnerabilities associated to climate impacts in Morocco, but also in North Africa. And this leads us to last year's decision on the global goal on adaptation. So last year in COP28 in Dubai, parties settled on a global goal on adaptation framework. Just to be clear, the GGA, the global goal on adaptation, is kind of like the equivalent of the 1.5 for adaptation. So that was something that the Arab group, the African group, the developing countries have been vouching for the past 30 years. And finally, they settled on a framework and on this equivalent of 1.5 for adaptation. But I just wanted to flag that it was not that much of a celebration. It was not that much of a win, actually, because this GGA framework does not really although it represents a solid basis for ambition when it comes to adaptation, it does not at all address the real needs and priorities of developing countries when it comes to building adaptive capacity and resilience, because first of all, it lacks indicators to track the progress on the targets that were set, the thematic and dimensional targets that were set, and it also lacks the necessary means of implementation. So basically, we have this beautiful academic, super technical GGA framework that can track action but not support, which leaves us then in the same status quo. Basically, we're not breaking the business as usual approach of adaptation within this UNFCCC regime. And although there has been like some work that's been mandated to really fix these like loose ends of the GGA framework, there's still lots to be done. The mandate is for next year to wrap up all these loose ends around the GGA framework, but I just wanted to flag that this year is also very important. We still need a lot of political impetus. We need more correlation between the different processes that are happening. So the NCQG is kind of taking all the limelight right now, but let's not forget that this NCQG is supposed to have an ambitious adaptation commitment proposal within it. And this adaptation commitment, well, its future depends on GGA, and the GGA also depends, well, its implementation depends on NCQG, so just wanted to flag that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm open to questions from the floor now. Please. We have Mark first. Sorry.
Thank you very much. So you've well articulated the mounting climate crisis that we've seen around the world, and particularly in Africa. This goes for Joyce. So we already have minimum financial support. So yet adaptation funds are always tied with conditions. So how does Africa broadly, even if you look at Kenya, because you're from Kenya, intend to navigate these barriers? And then do you think enough is being done by African leaders to push back on these restrictions? And then to Rachel, so climate finance promises remain unfulfilled.
Yeah, we're having trouble.
Sorry? Oh, okay. So Rachel, climate finance promises remain unfulfilled, especially in adaptation funding, which has been said well by Said. And for the vulnerable regions. So why should developing nations trust that new pledges being made today in this COP will be honored? And then how does the Union of Concerned Scientists plan to ensure accountability of these commitments?
Sorry, could you just clarify the first part of your question on Africa?
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
It is about the barriers of adaptation funding. And do you think African leaders are pushing back on these restrictions enough?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question. I think it's an excellent question. I think on the barriers for adaptation, and one of them is financial barriers, I think what African leaders, what I know for sure, and I'm part of the delegation and part of those discussions that I've went into that, is they've come here with a very clear mind on what they need. So they have a quantum in mind, they have a roughly a quantum of 1.3 trillion, so that the adaptation needs that have identified the continent would require. They're here for that and they're pushing for that. But of course we know that there are barriers that exist with them acquiring these resources. And of course, there's been a strong push on trying to rework on the financial architecture itself so that it can actually allow them access funds that are not very punitive in the sense that now most of African countries are actually sunk in debt trying to respond to disasters, right? So they are digging into their pockets, they're diverting resources that are meant for essential services like health provision, like for education, social facilities, to respond to disasters. And that is what is their biggest call in this COP, that they're saying that they really need to be response from the international community on supporting Africa, on agreeing into a quantum that can support the continent in responding to the adaptation needs. Yeah.
Thank you. And then the other half.
Yeah, I don't want to undersell the scale of the challenge that we face in the United States. Right now, we have coming into power an anti-science administration that calls climate change a hoax and will not live up to its global responsibilities. But the Biden administration is still the government, and we want them to support here an ambitious outcome on the NCQG on the scale of at least $1 trillion, which would be the respectable start, at least, to acknowledging the needs and indeed the funding that African nations deserve and other nations on the front lines of the crisis deserve. We're fighting back home in the United States to have a greater awareness of the responsibility of a richer nation like the US, which is the largest historical contributor to heat trapping emissions. We think that in addition to the NCQG goal here, outside of the COP forum, there will be an increased turn to litigation as well as a pathway, and fossil fuel companies need to be held accountable for the damage their products are causing. So those will continue to proliferate in courts around the world as well.
First question to Dr. Joyce. G77 plus China rejected the first draft of the NCQG, and now a second draft has come up, which is like 30 plus pages. Is G77 plus China now ready to negotiate on the new draft, or is that still unsatisfactory? Second question to Mariana. You're stressing that public grant finance is the quality of finance that is needed. I just came from a press conference with Germany, and they're saying the public is spooked by the $1 trillion figure, questioning, is that going to come from taxpayer money? So there seems to be a lobby that is pushing hard for most of climate finance to come from private sources. Governments say we don't have enough money, private banks, you pay. Private banks say we need guarantees, government, give us the guarantees. It seems like people are passing the ball. What's your perception on this? Will an NCQG, like, will there be even an agreement with people passing the buck like this?
Yes. The bloc for G77 and China rejected the first draft for not really the first draft. They didn't agree on using the draft as basis for negotiation because there's a lot of problematic issues in that draft. And one of them that is really dominating the discussions now is on the contribution base, right? So it's not been agreed exactly who will be contributing to this new quantified goal. And so it means that the negotiations actually haven't started because you can't start thinking about how much needs to go to the kitty without agreeing on who needs to put into that kitty. So I think that is the biggest divergent issue at the moment. And the bloc is hoping that there will be a better text on that, reflecting on their issues. They've been very clear on who needs to contribute, referencing on many other things that are principled within the convention. And so that will be, hopefully, in the next round of iteration of the text, this will be a text that will be agreeable and can set base for discussion.
So, actually, just 30 seconds on this last point. I know that the text, or certain interpretations will change, but there is on that draft key elements to secure that public grants-based finance at scale that we are talking about, as there is also all the other, private sector solutions that you were talking about, referenced by Germany. It is possible, yes, to raise public finance in the realm of trillions. We just look at the amount of fossil fuel subsidies that developed countries are still providing to fossil fuel companies. If we see the amount of profits that the fossil fuel companies are having, they're not taxed correctly. And if we tackle, tax dodging, tax avoidance, tax evasion, and the billions and trillions that is lost due to tax havens. So when we look at where the money is coming from, it is a multiple of sources. It's not just down to the taxpayer individuals, but it's the role of really shifting subsidies and making polluters will have a key role to play in delivering this large-scale grants-based finance that we are talking about here.
We have 3 minutes left. I'm looking for one sentence on what do we want to see or do we need to see in the next few days to know that we're on track for a good result. Who wants to go first?
Richer nations just have to stop ducking their responsibility. We need a strong NCQG outcome here, both in terms of the quantum and the quality. Hiding behind politics, we've run out of time because real people are hurting now all around the world.
We need to stop depoliticizing adaptation and make it less a technical work stream and more of and give it more political impetus, because as I said, for now it's just they're making it more and more confusing and difficult for negotiators, experts, and everyone involved in this process to even follow up with this adaptation. So what we need is more political impetus, and more finance, just more finance. More means of implementation, capacity building, technology transfer, and finance.
Putting in 2 sentences, just deliver what is said in the Paris Agreement. It's finance from developed to developing countries to fulfill their needs. So it's time to reclaim the role of public finance to deliver climate and development action.
I think for me, for sure, and I think you've touched on this point, is that it still really puzzles me a lot that the world is really easy to put a lot of money in fossil fuel subsidies yet and fund military and wars, but then when we come to discuss about the critical issues that affect humanity, we don't want to engage in these discussions. So it's really disappointing to be I've been part of this process. I see how it's really difficult for negotiators to engage here, and I really hope we can come together. If this is concerted effort, and we think this is a planet that we don't have a plan B, another planet, we should really go out of this city with a solid quantum for NCQG.
Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you all very much for coming. So much to choose from. Thank you very much. Thank you.